Hi, I'm Miss Pliskin, and today I'm building something like a cross between a Roman country house called a villa and a Roman city house called a domus. I'm starting this build with the most important room in the house, the atrium. This was a central courtyard where the man of the house would receive visitors. This room has a pool called an impluvium and an open roof where the roof slants inwards in order to drain rainwater into the pool. The perimeter of the atrium is surrounded by something called a peristyle, and this is a colonnaded walkway around the atrium. All the rest of the rooms branch off of this central room. And I gotta be honest, this felt super uncomfortable to start a build with the center of the house and move outwards. But yeah, at this point I had no idea what I was doing, and I was working off of a bunch of different floor plan ideas from various excavation sites. So bear with me a bit, because while I was constructing this floor plan, I was all over the place trying to figure out what the heck I was doing. The front door of these Roman houses would have had some sort of porch or portico to transition from the street to the front door. Sometimes this would be really simple, short little covered porch, or sometimes it would be an elaborate wraparound colonnade like what I'm building here, because I needed literally every scrap of potential exterior decor in order to make this look passable. Most buildings were made of stone or wood, but by the middle of the 2nd century, the discovery of concrete made that a really popular building material because it had a lot more versatility than stone or wood. You can see from some of these floor plans, like this one in particular, a house in the city would be closely surrounded by other buildings. They'd often have shared walls or would take up an entire city block and be surrounded on all sides by public roads. Urban planning was a big deal back then, and cities would be planned with gridded streets and subdivided lots in between. Sometimes houses would be expanded and take over an entire city block or more, and some houses overtook public roads, and at some point, laws had to be enacted to specifically prohibit building private homes on public land. Now, gentlemen, don't take things that don't belong to you. And I kind of had that in mind, where I add a bump out into the floor plan. When I do the terrain paint and landscaping later, you can see that I make this little bump out look like it's hanging out in the middle of a side road. So this house would definitely belong to a rich dude, no doubt. Most poor Romans lived in apartment buildings called insulae, and that's just Latin for the word island, because a lot of the time they would take up an entire city block and be surrounded on all sides by a public road, basically an island. These buildings were usually made of wood. Sometimes they were over 7 stories tall and way worse than your modern day tenement building. And they were super susceptible to fires because the only heating people had were open braziers, and the only lighting was oil lamps, and they were both pretty flammable. The lower floors were more expensive, larger, possibly even venturing to middle-class accommodations, whereas the upper floors would be tiny, cramped, one-room apartments. The people that lived in these upper floors had no way to cook at home, so they'd mostly just eat at the local tavern or sometimes just graze through the open markets. I chose to build this house in Tartosa because, say what you want about the wedding pack, and there's a lot to say, the world is fantastic. It's one of my favorite worlds now, to be honest. The world has a Mediterranean feel, which I thought was a perfect place to plop a Roman build down because the Romans really got around. At its peak, the Roman Empire stretched north all the way up to the bottom of Scotland and south into Africa down the Nile up to modern-day Sudan. The floor plans I found build inspiration from were actually from a bunch of Roman settlements in Africa during the first couple of centuries AD, which largely reflect the styles across the whole of the Roman Empire. These first 2 centuries of the Roman Empire were pretty great, actually. The empire was prosperous, there was relatively little religious persecution happening, and there was a huge middle class and a lot of diversity. Part of how such a diverse crowd across a huge empire was able to have a solid Roman identity was that Rome had an impressively uniform standard of institutions and architecture. Not to say there wasn't racial tension, especially against the Greeks. The Romans had such a weird view of the Greeks. Romans enslaved the Greeks, thought they were shifty and untrustworthy, but at the same time absolutely coveted Greek art and literature. Having Greek slaves educating your sons Owning original Greek sculpture and speaking Greek would have made you look like a real high-class Roman. I wonder if there was something like an empire-wide inferiority complex happening there with how much the Romans stole from the Greeks and called their own. Jealous much? So it's right about now when I'm trying to roof the back of this house that I'm thinking to myself, I've made a horrible mistake. Am I really committed to doing this? No, I am not. I end up redoing the entire back of this house because this sea of shingles had to go. So yeah, here I go, trimming a ton of space off of the back of this building. And at some point, I also moved this place to a slightly smaller lot just to try to make the building feel more crowded on the lot, as if it were a city house. Working on the exterior of this house was tough because by and large, these houses were just big old boxes and not very appealing from the outside, so I had to stretch the bounds of the floor plan references I had to make it look not totally terrible in The Sims. Windows didn't have glass and would be closed with shutters or have stone or terracotta lacework inside them. These windows from Felixander's Hellenistic set are perfect for a Roman build. Other exterior features I'd normally default to in order to add some dimension weren't an option. For example, chimneys and fireplaces weren't invented yet, so that's out. Roman homes were commonly heated with open braziers, but the fancy Roman houses would have something called hypocaust heating. This is where they'd have a shallow basement-like space under their floor where they'd have fires and pipe the hot air under the floors across the house. Now this is an interesting space. This is another one of the really important rooms in the house called an exedra, and we can tell that these were important because of the higher quality mosaics and frescoes found. This would be a large space with raised platforms designed for conversation, like an ancient version of a gentleman's smoking room. Sometimes these would be niches carved out in the exterior of a building. You see that in some Roman public buildings, and they're designed for public speaking. But a lot of the floor plans I saw had them as large interior spaces. Later on in the Roman Empire, with the rise of Christianity, these rooms were more likely private basilicas, basically private churches, and the rounded niche transformed into the nave. Only the really, really nice houses had their own water supplies. If your house didn't have its own water supply, as most didn't, you'd send your slaves out every morning to fetch water for the day. And personal hygiene was a really big deal. Public baths were really cheap. Even the very poor could afford to visit the public baths, but the very rich had their own private baths in their homes. Privacy wasn't really a concept as we think of it now. If a Roman was out and about and had to use the bathroom, they'd go to a public latrine, which were, I kid you not, rows of side-by-side toilets with no dividers or separation. I'm not joking. Going to the bathroom was a social opportunity. Ugh, I can't even imagine. Speaking of public versus private, Roman houses didn't have defined public or private spaces. I guess in some ways it's kind of like a gradient of 100% public space when the vestibule doors are open and slowly gets more and more private the farther into the house you get. This is the atrium. Like I said before, this is the most important room in the house where the man of the house would receive visitors. Sometimes an atrium would be completely paved with mosaics and some were decorated with plants. So the plant route is the one that I took because I felt this would look way better landscaped than just a bunch of bare floor. This is also the room where weddings would take place. Roman weddings were surprisingly simple affairs. They happened in the bride's father's house, and the bride could be legally as young as 12, but on average was 14. And the whole ceremony consists simply of the bride declaring in front of all of the guests that she now belongs to her husband. Other than weddings, this room was routinely used for the man of the house to receive his clients. These were people that he was the patron of. These could be any number of types of people he financially supported or did business with. In general, the patron-client relationship was a bit like a groupie. The clients were required to flatter, entertain, and otherwise publicly support their patron. There are a lot of funny stories of clients having to bite their togas to stop themselves from calling out their patron. But the patron had money, so, you deal with it. Romans called the entryway the vestibulum, or the vestibule. This would be guarded by a trusted slave and guard dogs. And there was a lot of attention paid to the front door, actually. And oftentimes there'd be 3 front doors. one big door and two smaller doors, and depending on which door was open would indicate what sort of business or event was happening in the house that day. The dining room was called a triclinium, which literally means 3 couches, and was the formal eating place in the home and had, as the name implies, 3 couches for guests to recline on while they ate. That's not really practical for The Sims purposes. I did not want this to look like a living room, so I added a dining table and chairs, so really the furniture in this room is completely wrong. This formal dining room was also a very important room in the Roman house. The Roman family ate together, and the rich often hosted very elaborate dinner parties. This room would have intricate floor mosaics and beautiful frescoes on the wall. The idea was to show off to guests, so you definitely want to pour more money into decorating this room. If you were further inland, then seafood would be a particularly impressive thing to serve, and some dining rooms are decorated with highly accurate mosaics of seafood to further demonstrate the wealth that the house had. Furnishing the kitchen was pretty tough, actually. Obviously, the ancient Romans didn't have ice boxes or stoves. There was no way to preserve food, so the food for the day would have to be bought by a slave every morning. The owner of this house is probably pretty rich, so he'd have a Greek cook, also another way to show off. Like, kind of how having a French chef today would seem really fancy, having a Greek chef back then would seem equally fancy. The other way to show off was to have a mind-boggling meal. Some of the records we have of these meals include sow's udders filled with kidneys, dormouse covered in honey and poppy seeds, snails, urchins, oysters, and clams. One meal was called a Trojan pig, and this was a roasted pig stuffed with sausage and fruit, as the Trojan horse was stuffed with Greeks. Ha! Good joke, guys! In a few of the floor plans I looked at, I saw shops attached to the house. Some of these had direct access to the house, and it seems likely that the owner of the house would run those, and some other shops had no direct access to the house, and perhaps those were rented out to others to run their own businesses out of. Along with having shopfront space in these big old houses, some of them had separate small apartments attached to them that the owner would rent out. I'm adding a bunch of clutter to this shop. I sort of pictured it selling perhaps rare imported wine, something good enough for the owner of this fancy house. Off to the right side, you can see a couple of rooms I've turned into a small apartment. An apartment of this size wouldn't have been that unusual, but what is weird is that I gave this apartment its own atrium. I guess I was feeling generous, but really I didn't want the apartment to be so boring to look at. Another inaccuracy about this apartment is that I gave it a toilet. Toilets, as we know them, didn't exist yet, but I still wanted this house to function. There were no double beds in Rome, so the husband and wife would sleep separately, but I was feeling generous, and also I didn't want the master bedrooms to look like child rooms. So I gave the husband and wife double beds, but I did give them separate bedrooms. Beds were placed upon raised platforms, and simpler mosaics were on the floor underneath where the bed would cover it up anyway. Good thinking on their part, it probably saved them some money. I also added an antechamber in front of the 2 master bedrooms, since there'd often be a space like this to separate more highly trafficked spaces of the house from more private ones. There were also no closets in Rome. They'd keep their clothes in large chests, which, finally, something about this build is cutting me some slack. Usually converting real-life floor plans into The Sims requires some creative editing in order to cut out all the closets. But for these Roman floor plans, it's just a bunch of simple boxes, so thanks guys! Speaking of closets, men were only allowed to wear white togas, and that was it. I mean, if they were a knight, they could have a thin purple stripe on their toga, or if they were a senator, they could have a thick purple stripe on their toga, but that's literally it. Not a lot of options. Women, on the other hand, could dress in any color, except purple, and were able to flaunt their wealth through gold jewelry and super elaborate hairstyles done by their slaves. Women also had their slaves pluck their arm and leg hair. Really pale complexions were fashionable at the time in order to signify that the women weren't working outside, so women would wear a ton of white face makeup. Speaking of slaves, I feel I would be remiss in not mentioning slavery in Rome, given how integral slavery was to the Roman Empire. There were a lot of slaves in Rome, like a lot. Hundreds of thousands of slaves, bigger than in any other time in human history. And the main way that people were forced into slavery was by Rome conquering land and then enslaving those that they conquered. Another way was by being born to a slave. Interestingly, there were laws that required related slaves had to be kept together, which is a surprising hint of compassion. And rarer was people could be made slaves if they sold themselves into slavery. Super rich Romans owned hundreds of slaves. Most Romans did not own that many, but all Romans considered owning slaves to be a birthright. Even slaves themselves didn't advocate for abolition of slavery, nor did the Roman Christians, who accepted slaves as worshippers. Slavery was so ingrained in the psyche of the ancient people that abolition never even occurred to the most controversial philosophers at the time. One big difference between Roman and Greek slaves is that a larger portion of Roman slaves were able to achieve freedom at some point. If a slave was abandoned by its owner, the slave was freed, and slaves did have wages, and so a slave could eventually buy their own freedom with their wages. There were a number of former slaves that went on to be really successful. There were these 2 secretaries that worked under the Emperor Claudius that went on to be crazy rich, like 1%er rich. Obviously, that sort of scenario was super rare, but it wasn't uncommon for ex-slaves to go on to have a fairly decent career. I think Romans just had a weird concept of what it meant to be an independent person. I mean, literally, human rights didn't exist yet. So, yeah. Under Roman law, a son didn't become an independent adult until his father died. Could you imagine? Your dad lives to like 70 and you finally get to run your own life at the ripe old age of what, like 50? A daughter didn't ever become independent. A daughter would be under the absolute authority of her dad until he died, and then under the eldest male relative authority, perhaps a brother, and then under the authority of her husband. And when I say absolute authority, I mean women were functionally, legally treated very similar to slaves. Her father or husband could legally kill her for literally no reason at all. Women didn't even have their own names until like way late in the empire. So that should probably give you a good idea of how women were viewed. They were just referred to by their family name. Women traveling outside of the house had to be completely covered from head to toe. Really rich women traveled by litter, where slaves would carry her around in a curtained box to hide her from view, and all women needed to be chaperoned. If you were a poor woman, though, you might have a little bit more independence out of necessity because you needed a job. Unsurprisingly, it was illegal for women to commit adultery, but not illegal for men. And if you think all of this sounds grim, this was actually an improvement over the situation with Greek women. Greek women were rarely allowed to leave their homes, and if their husbands ever had visitors over for a swanky dinner or something, the women were expected to stay hidden in a separate part of the house. After the transition from Roman Republic to Roman Empire following the assassination of Caesar, women did gain some more independence, though. Women were allowed to control their own finances, divorce, and had some relative independence. Of course, there were men at that time that longed for the good old days, where women sat at home spinning wool all day. Unsurprisingly, women couldn't vote or hold public office, but there was a lot of evidence to show that they did participate in politics, going to public rallies and endorsing politicians. So yeah, needless to say, being a woman in Roman times wouldn't have been super fun. And now to pivot to something actually fun, I'm trying to make the house look not like a blank cube. My goal here was to make it look like there are vines and grass creeping up through the cobblestone streets to kind of give the exterior more character. And one tip I can give for terrain paint is to put a border of dirt around all the house walls, fencing, and paths to kind of soften up those stark edges a bit. We're coming up to the end of the build now, but stick around to the very end for some glamour shots, and let me know in the comments if you have any building or architecture style requests. If you're interested in art, architecture, and history, please consider subscribing. I have many more of these videos planned, and thank you so much for watching.